Welcome everyone. In this video, I will present an overview of my research into the atomic bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The idea that no atomic bombs were detonated at either city is hardly novel. However, most people who make this assertion spend little time on the question what really happened in the two cities. The prevailing idea is that these were just two more run-of-the-mill fire bombings, such as those which had occurred in Tokyo and Nagoya, for example. We will see today that this is not the case. Instead, the Americans went to great lengths to make these bombings special and to fake the appearance of nuclear detonations. What sort of evidence are usually cited to support the official story of the atomic bombings? The most important ones are the unprecedented extent of destruction. The bombings also left behind some radioactive fallout. Then there are the many cases of radiation sickness and of alleged flash burns among the victims. And finally, the atomic shadows, for example, of people who were allegedly evaporated in an instant with only their shadows remaining on the wall or the pavement. Aside from the evidence, we also have the political and historical consequences to consider. We will look at each of these questions briefly today, and I may cover them separately and in more detail in future videos. I have written a book on this topic which contains all the literature references for this talk. Therefore, in this video, I will not give the references for the evidence which I show. You can look them up in the book. The electronic version is free, but you can also buy a printed copy if you prefer. You may also wonder what qualifies me for this sort of investigation. I am an MD by training, and much of the evidence we will see is indeed medical. And I have worked as a researcher and professor in biochemistry and biophysics for my whole career. Moreover, the book has been reviewed by several very competent scientists from various fields: physics, chemistry, biology, medicine, and history. Now, let's get into the evidence and start with the signs of destruction in both cities. Were they really unprecedented? Here is the assessment of Alexander de Seversky, an early expert witness. He started out as a fighter pilot for his native Russia in World War I. Shortly afterwards, he emigrated to the United States and became a successful aeronautical engineer, and he had good connections to the US government. After World War II, he was sent on an inspection tour of the bombed-out cities in Germany and Japan. He had seen many such cities before visiting Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As you can see from this quote, he found no evidence of any unusual effects, and he seems almost disappointed. This quote only references Hiroshima, but he confirms the same for Nagasaki later on. Seversky supports his argument with a number of photographs, and this is one of them. The picture shows buildings standing near a river arm which traverses Hiroshima, and these buildings were very near the hypocenter, which is the point on the ground which is straight beneath the explosion. In both cities, the atomic bombs are said to have been detonated some 500 to 600 meters up in the air. Some buildings are destroyed, but others appear to be still structurally intact. Seversky also notes that the stone buildings in Berlin had looked more severely damaged than in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Only the many wooden buildings in both cities had been razed by the fires which broke out after the attacks. In summary, the extent of destruction does not exceed that of conventional bombings. Let us turn to the next piece of evidence, the radioactive fallout. Before we look at some studies, we will consider what sort of fallout we should expect. The two bombs are said to have been of different types. The Hiroshima bomb allegedly contained 50 kilograms of uranium-235, of which only 1 kilogram is said to have fissioned. Therefore, the other 49 kilograms should have come down somewhere, not all of it in the city, but we should expect a good amount of it. The 1 kilogram that did fission should have produced some 35 grams of cesium-137, which is widely used as a fallout marker. This does not sound like much, but detection of radioactivity is very sensitive. The Nagasaki bomb allegedly contained 6 kilograms of plutonium, of which again 1 kilogram is said to have fissioned. The other 5 kilograms should be found somewhere on the ground, and again some 35 grams of cesium should have been formed as well. The bomb test at Alamogordo, New Mexico in July 1945 is said to have been carried out with a plutonium bomb as well, of the type used at Nagasaki. Here we are looking at the gamma ray spectrum of a soil sample from Hiroshima. This sample contains both radioactive fallout and natural background radioactivity. The sample was collected 3 days after the bombing, that is, before fallout could have been washed away by rain or blown away by the wind. The cesium peak is very small. Several natural background peaks are higher. The highest of these is due to potassium 40. The measurement was conducted in 1996. In the 50 years since the war, about two-thirds of the cesium had decayed, which means that the cesium peak would have been 3 times higher if it had been measured in 1945. But even at that time, the activity of cesium would have been lower than those of several naturally occurring radioactive isotopes. In later years, atomic bomb tests were conducted by Russia, the United States, and other nations, and the fallout was dispersed across the globe, particularly the Northern Hemisphere. Remarkably, the fallout of those later bomb tests is higher than that of the Hiroshima bombing, even directly in Hiroshima itself. Now we are looking for the uranium, of which there should be a whole lot more than of the cesium. In Hiroshima, the fallout is said to have been carried by the famous black rain, which started falling about an hour after the bombing. What we see here are black raindrops on a plasterboard in a house whose roof had been blown off in the attack. This is probably as good a sample of fallout as it gets. Now, all samples may contain not only bomb uranium, but also some natural background uranium from the plaster. We might wonder what is the highest proportion of bomb uranium that we can detect. You might have guessed it, it is 0.2%, not nothing at all, but next to nothing. In conclusion, in Hiroshima we find only tiny amounts of fission products and also of bomb uranium. A close look at the isotope mixture in the fallout shows that the dispersed material came from a reactor and not from a bomb detonation, but we won't go into those details now. Now we are looking at a map of Nagasaki. Here there is a higher level of fallout, but most of it is found in the Nishiyama Reservoir, a small body of water located at about 3 kilometers from the hypocenter. Again, the hypocenter is the point directly underneath the detonation, which is supposed to have occurred up in the air. Why the fallout should be concentrated in this particular spot seems a bit of a mystery, but we will get to the bottom of it, and quite literally. Because in 2008, a group of Japanese researchers carried out a study on the sediment of this reservoir. They drilled up a core from that sediment, sliced it up, and looked for radioactivity in the various slices. The earliest and highest peak of plutonium and cesium activity was found at a depth of about 440 centimeters within the sediment. They also found a layer containing charcoal particles, which correspond to the soot from the burning city. This layer is found about 15 centimeters below the radioactivity peak. Now, since the study was carried out 63 years after the bombing, some 7 centimeters of sediment had been deposited every year on average. This suggests that the radioactivity was deposited in the reservoir only about 2 years after the bombing. Could this be? Let us ask this gentleman. Arthur Compton, the head of the physics division of the Manhattan Project, that is, of the US atomic bomb construction effort. He was also a physics Nobelist who had discovered Compton scattering early on in his career. Compton was particularly keen on developing the plutonium bomb technology. On May 31, 1945, he stated before a secret committee in Washington that plutonium had not yet been purified, that developing the methods for purification would take another 2 years, which fits with the observation in the sediment, and production of enough plutonium for building bombs would take another year after that. Other statements in the meeting protocol imply that only very small amounts of enriched uranium were available as of that date. Therefore, uranium bombs couldn't have been built either. In conclusion, both experimental studies and documents show that atomic bombs simply were not ready at the time. Now, if there were no atomic bombs, then what caused the many cases of radiation sickness among the victims? Note that we are talking here only about acute radiation sickness, which results from exposure to high doses. This is not about cancer or leukemia, which may be induced by lower doses but take several years to become manifest. Acute radiation sickness results from damage to the bone marrow, the hair follicles, and the intestinal mucous membranes. Bone marrow damage causes a lack of blood platelets, which leads to bleeding, as seen in the young man on the left. Hair loss is seen in the boy on the right. All of these symptoms can also be produced with chemicals. You likely know the typical side effects of cytotoxic anti-cancer chemotherapy. Can we find out whether the cases which were observed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were indeed caused by radiation or rather by some chemical agent? The first question we can ask is, does the observed distribution of radiation sickness correspond to that of bomb radiation? The radiation released in the detonation should have been deadly to everyone who was exposed to it within 1 kilometer of the hypocenter, out in the open without any shielding from buildings. On the other hand, since radiation doses drop rapidly with distance, acute radiation sickness should not have occurred in anyone beyond 2 kilometers. We note again that this does not mean cancer and leukemia. Those may be caused in some people later on, also by smaller doses, and accordingly at larger distances. Now, are these predictions true? No, they are not. Here we see a statistic on people who had been out in the open during the Hiroshima bombing and who were still alive 20 days later. There were 105 such persons which were exposed within 1 kilometer. Most of them developed acute radiation sickness, but on the other hand, most of these recovered. Only about 1/5 is known to have died in the following months. On the other hand, there were some cases of acute radiation sickness beyond 2 kilometers and even 3 and 4 kilometers from the hypocenter. This distribution contradicts radiation as the cause of disease. These numbers are from Hiroshima only, but those from Nagasaki are similar. Another observation that disagrees with the atomic bomb story is the occurrence of acute radiation sickness in people who were outside Hiroshima during the bombing but who entered the city shortly afterwards. Radiation doses high enough to induce acute radiation sickness should have been released and received only in the instant of the detonation. However, here we see a statistic on several hundred people who entered the city after the bombing, presumably to help with rescue and recovery. There is a clear correlation between the chance of developing acute radiation sickness with the time spent near the hypocenter. This observation is usually explained with radioactive fallout, but we have already seen above that the fallout radiation was very weak. It could not possibly have induced acute disease. The conclusion is that the distribution of acute radiation sickness in time and space does not agree with its causation by radiation. Something else must have caused it. Aside from statistics, we also have some anecdotal evidence which disproves the presence of deadly radiation. The first quote is from an American physician who was working at a hospital in Osaka only a few weeks after the bombings and was caring for several victims from Hiroshima. One of his patients reported having been almost exactly at the hypocenter. This patient should have died almost immediately. The report doesn't say if he survived long term, but he never even should have made it to Osaka. Some miracle survivors were still encountered in the 1960s when they were interviewed in order to determine the individual radiation doses. When they reported having been very near the hypocenter during the bombing, they were brushed off, and their testimony was simply discarded as a fantasy. The difficulties with the evidence were not lost on this gentleman, Ashley Artisan. He was a surgeon from Yale University who was then serving in the US military. He had organized the Binational Joint Commission of Physicians and Scientists. This commission collected and analyzed the medical data on survivors who had been alive 20 days after the bombings, some of which I showed on the previous slide. He wrote in his report that he could not understand the absence of radiation symptoms in lethally irradiated people. The report was published in 1956. That same year, Artisan died in a plane crash in Colombia. 3 of his 6 American colleagues on the commission reportedly also died while still young, but I have been unable to ascertain the times and circumstances of their deaths. If radiation sickness was not caused by bomb radiation, then what else could have caused it? It turns out that we don't have to look very far. There is plenty of eyewitness testimony that points us in the right direction. Many eyewitnesses noticed poisonous gas. It caused pain and respiratory distress when inhaled, also hair loss, as noted by the boy. It was released early on in the bombing, as noted by Suzuki, but it also lingered, as noted by Burchett. Burchett was an Australian journalist who managed to sneak into Hiroshima in early September when the city was out of bounds for civilians. The Japanese witnesses he spoke to mixed up the poison gas with radioactivity. It seems they were told a bullshit story about the atomic bombs having somehow released poisonous gas. What might this poison gas have been? The most likely candidate is mustard gas, also called sulfur mustard. This is the chemical formula. It contains a sulfur atom right in the middle. It was used in World War I in Europe and also by the Japanese in World War II in China. The US had stockpiled it during World War II and filled it into aerial bombs. It would have been available and ready. Mustard gas stinks, as noted by Burchett. It is not actually a gas, but an oily fluid with a high boiling point, which means that it evaporates slowly and can persist in the environment for weeks and months. Finally, it is known to cause radiation like effects. However, it also causes symptoms beyond those which are to be expected with radiation. We can use those additional symptoms to determine whether mustard gas or radiation caused those cases of acute radiation sickness. Here are some observations in early victims which are not explained by radiation but which can be explained by mustard gas. Capillary leak syndrome is exactly what the name suggests. The smallest blood vessels become leaky and blood fluid seeps freely into the tissues. The body swells up and the loss of blood volume causes extreme thirst. In keeping with this, many eyewitnesses from Hiroshima and Nagasaki report that people who had gathered around creeks or puddles to drink from them and whose bodies had swelled up so as to be completely disfigured. Capillary leak syndrome has also been reported with mustard gas. Oozing froth is due to lung surfactant. It is normally deep within the lung, but it gets mobilized in lung edema and spills out of the orifices. Toxic lung edema has also been reported in mustard gas victims who had no gas masks, in particular in Iranian soldiers in the war with Iraq in the 1980s. We also see signs of mustard gas poisoning in some of the few pathology reports we have on the victims. This is a cross section through lung tissue from a boy who died 3 days after the bombing. The white areas are the alveoli, which are the air-filled spaces deep within the lung where the gas exchange occurs. Normally, they should all be of similar size, but here we see some grossly inflated and others compressed. This is caused by partial or complete obstruction of the smallest bronchi. There were more such cases and they cannot be accounted for by radiation. On the other hand, the same picture is commonly described in reference works on mustard gas poisoning. Mustard gas is a blistering agent. It causes the skin to peel, and peeling skin is indeed reported in victims from both cities. The first quote here is from a report on another incident from World War II, which occurred in 1943. An American transport ship carrying bombs filled with mustard gas had been attacked by the Luftwaffe in the Italian port city of Bari. Numerous servicemen and civilians had been killed by the mustard gas that was released. This also proves the point that the Americans indeed possessed bombs filled with mustard gas. The second quote refers to victims from Hiroshima. The findings described in the two quotes are obviously similar. Descriptions of peeling skin are also found in eyewitness testimony from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Many victims in both cities suffered skin burns, which were mostly ascribed to the nuclear flash. In this slide, we see the scars of two patients burned with napalm and one burned by the flash of an atomic bomb. Which one is different? None of them is, they are all the same. All three burn victims show hypertrophic scars that have sharp outlines and irregular shapes. But a strong flash of light should affect all exposed skin areas evenly. On the other hand, burning gobs of napalm jelly that stick to the skin will cause a local burn. The intense heat causes severe tissue damage, which often leads to the formation of such hypertrophic scars or keloids afterwards. We also have eyewitness testimony to match from the days of the bombings. This description by a physician from Hiroshima evokes the famous napalm girl picture, which everyone has seen. The physician also gives a plausible explanation of the scarecrow posture. The burn victims spread their arms in order to avoid rubbing the burnt surfaces on their arms against those on the torso. How can we explain the nudity? Most likely, the victims had simply torn off their clothes to get rid of the burning napalm that was sticking to them. Here's another bit of evidence that disproves the story of the nuclear flash. Many eyewitnesses report having looked straight into the flash of the nuclear bomb. We must assume that there was some kind of flash, but was it as strong as it should have been? This picture shows the eye ground of an American soldier who had looked at the flash of a later bomb test. He suffered burns to his retinas. The volcano-like shape near the center is the scar of the burn caused by the retinal image of the flash. Similar lesions were observed in 5 other soldiers at distances of up to 10 miles. How many such cases were there in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? This time it's the big fat zero. By the way, the report on these burnt soldiers also suggests that some sort of nuclear detonations have indeed happened in later years. We now turn to the famous atomic shadows. The second quote refers to the bridge shown in this picture, which is located within 1 kilometer of the hypocenter. The author, Lebo, was another medical officer on the aforementioned Joint Commission. Aside from the bridge, his grand tour included several more attractions of a similar kind. We saw earlier that Seversky had not found any unusual signs that could prove the effects of atomic bombs. It is unlikely that he would not have been shown any of these atomic shadows if they had already existed at the time of his visit. The only plausible explanation is that these special effects were created between Seversky's visit in early September and Lebo's arrival in mid-October. Another sign that the shadows of the guardrail were fake is that they don't have the right length to match the story of the bomb. We know where the bridge is located relative to the point of the alleged detonation. We can detonate an imaginary bomb in that same position and project its light onto the bridge. We obtain shadows which are substantially longer than those which were observed. This finding confirms that those shadows were not produced by the bomb, but probably just spray painted onto the pavement. Another notable element of atomic tradition are the mushroom clouds. Many people who disbelieve the story of the atomic bombs assume that the mushroom clouds were simply the smoke of the burning cities. However, many eyewitnesses assert that the clouds formed very early on in the attack, before large-scale fires had broken out. The description of the clouds as colorful suggests that colored smoke bombs were used in their creation. Indeed, one eyewitness from Hiroshima reports a purple smoke bomb going off in her living room. What we see here is not an image of an atomic bombing, but of a party trick for sale by Amazon, not quite the same size, but the same idea. Overall, how were the atomic bombings faked? In each case, there was a flash, which many witnesses compared to a photographer's flash, but as we have seen, it was not strong enough to burn the skin or the eyes of the victims. The flash may have been created with photo-flash bombs or perhaps with thermobaric weapons. There also were loud bangs, but many eyewitnesses did not hear a bang at all, and those who did always thought it had been close by. Therefore, these bangs seem to have been local events. Bombs filled with napalm and mustard gas were likely detonated in the air. Burning napalm raining down is suggested by multiple eyewitness reports. Regarding the mustard gas, again, it's called a gas, but it really is a fluid which also would have rained down after being released in the air. In Hiroshima, rainfall was induced possibly with cloud seeding. While it was raining, black rain was sprayed from planes to disperse reactor waste to fake the bomb fallout. Several eyewitnesses described this black rain as oily. The purpose of the watery rain may have been to disguise the oil containing the radioactivity, but that failed because the oil drops collected soot on the way down through the smoke clouds from the burning city. It seems that the Americans did not try the same trick again in Nagasaki. In the aftermath of the bombings, the trickery was continued in order to maintain the deception. Napalm burns were explained as flash burns. The poison gas was simply blamed on the atomic bombs, even though this makes no sense, because radiation does not magically create poison gas. Atomic shadows were painted on walls and pavements. Last but not least, heavy censorship was imposed that lasted for years and which was particularly severe with respect to medical research. Now, it was one thing to fool the general population, and it was another to fool the Japanese government, which had the support of scientific and military experts. I believe that the Japanese authorities were not fooled at all, but that they were forced to collude in staging the bombings. There are many lines of evidence that point to this conclusion. A straightforward one is the failure to trigger an air alarm in both cities. In Hiroshima, an air alarm had actually been in effect, but it was lifted minutes before the bombing. Since there was no single nuke, there must have been many planes in the air to deliver the various kinds of ordnance, and the Japanese air defense could not possibly have overlooked these planes. The Japanese military was also very familiar with mustard gas. They had used it themselves in China, and they would have recognized its use in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nishina, a famous physicist, must have understood immediately that the evidence of destruction and of fallout did not add up. The final question is, why did the Americans stage these atomic bombings? It was not to win the war. The Japanese had been asking for peace negotiations many months earlier. According to MacArthur, the Americans could have made peace and avoided all the fighting in Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and so on. The faked atomic bombings were not really part of the fighting, but were instead just terror attacks intended to instill general fear of an impending nuclear war. The motive behind the scheme is spelled out in this early propaganda booklet written by a number of illustrious scientists, including Einstein and Oppenheimer. The people should be frightened into giving up their national sovereignties and submitting to a brand new and benevolent world government. Why did this effort fail? Ultimately, because Stalin wasn't going along. Now, the nuclear scam is not over yet. The bulletin of the atomic scientists is determined to keep it going. These so-called scientists have in the meantime adopted several other worthy causes, including COVID and climate change. The solution is always more centralized control and governance by international bodies. They are also the inventors of the famous doomsday clock, which has been stuck at 5 minutes or less before midnight for over 75 years. The 100 seconds to midnight shown here are from yesteryear. Now it's merely 90 seconds. I hope you are duly frightened now. So, to wrap up, the alleged atomic bombings were elaborate hoaxes, not mere fire bombings. Both physical and medical effects were staged using various tricks. The popular myth that the bombings shortened the war and saved American lives is the exact opposite of the truth. Without them, peace could have been had much earlier. Novel ideas presented here include the use of mustard gas to fake radiation sickness, and that the Japanese government was forced to collude in staging the bombings. Again, for a fuller discussion of the evidence, please take a look at my website at mpalmer.heresy.is. Thank you for your interest and have a good day.